So the foundations of trait theories, basically we're going to talk a little bit about the history of how sort of trait theory developed. And so trait theories are anything that kind of has a biological or psychological basis, and so it's something about the individual, so it's an individual trait. So the foundations of this is inherently in positivism, although positivism does cover a range of different types of theories, because positivism basically just means anytime we're using the scientific method combined with direct observations, and that's sort of how we acquire knowledge. So while this can be used for and sort of supports a lot of different theories, you can see why it has certainly a direct relationship to things like biological and psychological theories and sort of anything about observing human behavior. And so basically from a positivist perspective, the idea is that if something is not directly observable and it's not thus testable, then it's not really a worthwhile idea or sort of anything worth putting our time into. So ideas like babies are born innocent, you can't test that, you can't observe that, so that's kind of a pointless idea. The idea God listens, or unicorns are real, but they're just not visible to humans. Like anything that's not directly observable and you can't use the scientific method from a positivist perspective, we basically should not even look into that. So biological positivism then is one part of positivism, and it's sort of one application, I suppose, of positivism. And this is where research was done linking biological traits, brain functioning, personality to criminal behavior. However, this caused problems like phrenology. And so if you don't know what phrenology is, it is basically where they used to think that they could use the shape of somebody's skull to determine various different aspects about their personality, including their likelihood of criminality. And so they would look at external cranial characteristics, which were then supposedly linked to where larger sections of the brain were, which were then supposed to relate to behavior. So literally, you have a bump here. This means you're more, aggressive or whatever. Definitely 100% debunked now, but there is sort of a lot of things that kind of developed out of this way of thinking. Enter Cesare Lombroso. So Lombroso was very much about this, biological positivism, and that there are these traits that we can link to criminality. And so he basically looked at whether people who violated the law, this is just like not your run-of-the-mill like petty thief kind of thing, but like serious law violators. But he looked at whether they were physically different from non-law violators. And so he was talking about the most serious offenders, so, chronically aggressive, impulsive, and causing a lot of societal problems, essentially. But he basically said that these people were born criminals and that they had these primitive, savage traits. So he literally, in his notebooks, he had drawings like this one here. And because he would point out things like these savage traits were things like big jaws, strong canine teeth, large sloping foreheads, receding hairline, bumpy faces, whatever that means, broad noses, fleshy lips, sloping shoulders, long arms, pointy fingers. So things like this, he literally was meticulous about having notes like this comparing the more primitive, savage traits with sort of everybody else. So, hence, he came up with the idea of the born criminal. And this is where the term atavism comes from, which you may or may not have heard that term before, but he talked about the atavistic man, and so that just basically means primitive. And so these atavistic men, which of course, historically, the focus was always only on men, but the atavistic men were seen as the serious criminals because they were essentially not evolved. They were, and it's not that they had devolved, but rather they're not positive in the sense that everybody else is moving forward on that evolutionary timeline. We are, we're improving, we are getting more sophisticated, and they are basically staying the same. They're like stagnant on that evolutional timeline. And so it's not that they have regressed, but it's that they never moved forward in the first place. So that's kind of where that difference is. But he kind of saw them as stuck back on that evolutionary timeline. However, as you can imagine, there were major problems with Lombroso's methodology because we know none of this stuff is true now. Like, you cannot determine likelihood of criminality strictly from physical characteristics. But he was having all of this, methodological proof and he did research and he had all those meticulous notes, but he had a lot of problems in terms of what that methodology looked like. It was simplistic, for one. It was naive in how he how he created the connections, and it had like you're either atavistic or not, and it was very simplistic and naive. But the biggest thing is that he was aiming to prove his hypothesis without the methodological caution that the scientific method necessitates. And so he had this hypothesis that these things were true about atavism and that the evolutionary timeline and how you can compare the criminals to the non-criminals, and it's all, you can tell based on what they look like. He had all of those, that was his hypothesis right from the beginning, and so he manipulated his facts to fit his hypotheses about these differences. And so he would throw out cases that disproved his hypothesis, he would exaggerate cases that supported it, and so it's a very, very flawed, invalid methodology. So hence why we know that that's not true now. But he had a lot of, just like sort of biological positivism in general, it created all of these theories. He had a big impact on creating more and more biological positivism theories. And so William Sheldon then came directly from that idea of Cesare Lombroso type thinking. And and so this was like 1940s by the time we're getting to Sheldon. But he focused on body shape. So while Lombroso talked about all of the specific features, Sheldon kind of used that idea but focused just on body shape. And so he had these three main types, and even though the pure types were rare, he still kind of described the three main types. This is kind of a summary of the three main types. So you had the endomorph, the ectomorph, and the mesomorph. Then he did kind of at one point recognize that more people actually fall in this balanced, which means you're somewhere in between these kind of extremes. And it was actually the Glukes, though, that added the balanced category. It wasn't Sheldon himself. But people did sort of say, well, there's some use for this kind of theory, but we have to recognize that people fall somewhere in between. And so Sheldon examined 200 juvenile delinquents over the course of 10 years. He compared them to college students. And so he then, basically, this is how he came up with his typology here. So the endomorphs are, and again, we're only talking about men here. So the endomorphs are essentially your fat guys. They have wide hips, narrow shoulders, so that pear-shaped body, a lot of fat on the body, including the upper arms and thighs, but then they have slim wrists and ankles because they don't have any muscle. And then you have your ectomorph, which is kind of on the opposite side. So those are the tall, skinny, lanky guys with no muscles. So they have narrow shoulders and hips, a thin face, high forehead, thin, narrow chest and abdomen, thin legs and arms, very little muscle or body fat. And then the mesomorph is kind of this one in the middle, which is essentially the athletic build. And so there's the broad shoulders and narrow hips, so it's the wedge shape as opposed to the pear shape of the endomorph. A large head, muscular body, strong forearms and thighs, very little body fat. So these are sort of now seen as the extremes, but that's kind of all Sheldon recognized. But he basically saw based on his analysis of his 200 juvenile delinquents compared to college students, it was mostly mesomorphs in the delinquent group and mostly ectomorphs in the college group. And so from that, he kind of basically determined that the mesomorphs are the most likely to be criminal, especially violent. And part of that is because of just basically the physical capabilities. If you are athletically built, you are more capable of violence. But then he also said the endomorphs might be more likely to commit crimes compared to the ectomorphs, but they'd be less strenuous crimes, so things like fraud. Also, he said the endomorphs were more likely to be mentally ill and suffer from mental illness. And the ectomorphs, he said, were least likely to commit crimes overall, but they were also more likely to commit suicide. So these things have not really gotten much support. The only thing that is kind of useful from this kind of typology is the idea that if we go on a case by case, this can maybe help explain why certain people are committing certain types of crimes. I mean, it just makes sense that when we look at physical capabilities, that mesomorphs are going to, or people kind of closer to the mesomorph extreme, I guess, are going to be more likely to do certain things. Like, you're not going to be able to scale a building to the second floor balcony to break into a place if you are a big fat guy. It's just you're not going to be able to do that. Or if you don't have the muscle mass, if you're an ectomorph, you don't have the muscle mass to do that. So the capabilities make sense. And a mesomorph is probably going to be more likely to get into a fight because people are going to be more likely to pick fights with them in order to gain status. But then they're also going to be more likely to win the fights, which might mean they're actually injuring people and getting in trouble for that. So some of it kind of makes sense, but only it doesn't really help us though, because we can't go around saying, oh, you're built like this, so, we need to keep an eye on you because you're going to cause trouble. You can't do that, but it can explain sort of some of the proclivities, I guess, based on body type at best. But those pure types are very rare, and most people are balanced somewhere in the middle. However, these types of biological determinism type theorizing led to a lot of problems like eugenics. And so anything that leads us to eugenics is probably not the road we want to be on. And so this is very much, eugenics is based on determinism. It's this idea that there are certain traits in the population that we don't want there. And so eugenics is about reducing the traits that we don't want in our population and improving on and increasing the traits that we do want. And on the extreme end, this is resulting in genocide. But it also kind of happens at a little bit lower levels leading up to that. So you have both positive and negative eugenics, and do not confuse positive eugenics with it being anything morally positive. This is about where the focus is. So either it's about encouraging the traits that we want. And that's where we're trying to, increase the best and the brightest in our population and the ones that have the traits that we want. We want to encourage those people to, have more babies. And so that might look like, government assistance for childcare or things like that, going, towards certain types of people, possibly with certain skin tones that are more likely to get funding like that. Or, whatever, based on whatever traits the person who's engaging in eugenics is wanting. Versus negative eugenics, which is the opposite, which is about discouraging the worst and the dumbest. So trying to prevent the traits that we don't want in our population from being there. And so that can even get up to the point of even things like forced and mass sterilizations. So that would be the negative eugenics part. So this type of thinking is definitely not cool in a post-World War II world, because eugenics and determinism, that was Hitler's whole thing. This idea that he had certain people that he thought were impure and were ruining the purity of the bloodlines or whatever. And so it was about getting rid of what he didn't want in society. And so this tainted the whole idea of any kind of biological based theories, because it became seen as if it's even remotely biological determinism, it's heading in this direction, which is not a cool thing to happen. So biological theories became a super bad thing right around this time. And so biological theorists, to kind of address this, but while still recognizing that there are biological components, came up with the Diathesis-Stress Model. And so this is basically combining the biological side with the sociological or situational factors as well. So it's the biological predisposition. So certain people are more predisposed to violence or aggression or what have you. But that predisposition alone is not enough to create a criminal. It has to be combined with some kind of environmental stressor to then lead to crime. So more modern biological theories take into account both nature and nurture side of the nature-nurture debate. And so essentially the Diathesis-Stress Model says that environmental conditions interact with human traits to then influence behavior. So it's that combination. And so you have physical traits and the environment kind of together create a very unique individual behavioral pattern, because each offender is unique physically and mentally, but also they have very unique, environmental stressors and environmental conditions, but also like their experiences and their learning and everything like that kind of incorporates into that. And so that means that it's going to be this combination of the physical traits, and the environment. And so so the diathesis stress is all about it being that combination of something biological or physical, or something about the individual person plus that environment. But then that creates this unique, because nobody's going to have those same two combinations of traits and environmental experiences. And importantly, though, these types of theories that kind of use this diathesis-stress model, which kind of incorporates any of these biological theories, because none of them are purely biological determinism anymore. But it's important to note that these are focusing on basic human behavior and drives. So focusing on the kind of overarching types of deviant or destructive behavior. So things like aggression, violence, impulsivity, rather than actual law-breaking behavior. So these are not specifically designed to address lawbreakers or criminals per se, so much as explain the underlying drives that are clearly connected to criminality. But if we were to just focus on law-breaking behavior, then we think about some laws are very situation dependent. So things like speeding or underage drinking. And so like if you're speeding, it could just be because you're in this zone. If you were going the same speed in a different zone, it wouldn't be speeding. And underage drinking, if you're doing that same behavior, but once you're of age, it's no longer an issue. So those things are very situation dependent, and they're not really representative of basic human drives that cause pain in society. So another way to think about it is that if we're looking at these trait theories, they're focusing on the mala in se type crimes, or sort of at least the underlying drives and behavior for those crimes, as opposed to like mala prohibita type crimes. So if you just sort of think about it as we are focusing on what causes people to be more aggressive or more violent or more impulsive, which then obviously leads to higher likelihoods of crime, but it's still a slightly different question.